Imagine a royal court where heirs die off one by one under terrifyingly mysterious circumstances, where whispers of poison are louder than the court orchestra, and at the heart of the intrigue stands a powerful stepmother. Into this viper's nest is sent the young princess, Sophia Charlotte. Her task is as simple as it is brutal. Produce an heir before she becomes the next victim. But what if the greatest nightmare awaited her not in the shadowy corridors of the palace, but in her own son's cradle? What is a queen to do when her long-awaited child, the hope of a nation, shows signs of being a true monster from his earliest years? Today, we tell the true story of the first queen of Prussia, a woman whose crown was a curse and whose life was more terrifying than any fiction. But before this Berlin abyss opened beneath her, there was another life. A life at the Hanoverian court, a world saturated not with poison, but with the ideas of the Enlightenment. Here, the young Princess Sophia Charlotte breathed the air of intellectual freedom. Her mother, Sophia of Hanover, was not merely a duchess, but one of the most brilliant women of her age, a correspondent of the great philosopher Leibniz. It was she who created a world for her daughter where a sharp mind was valued more than lavish gowns, where music was not background noise for balls, but the language of the soul, and where books were the dearest of friends. Sophia Charlotte was not raised to be a mere royal function, but a fully formed person, educated, deeply sensitive, and accustomed to respect. Yet, her mother was not only a philosopher, she was a pragmatic politician to the core. In the complex mosaic of German principalities, where marriage was the primary tool of the great game, the personal happiness of children was mere currency. Duchess Sophia looked at her daughter and saw not just a beloved child, but a strategic asset, the key to a powerful alliance with the Hohenzollern dynasty. Brandenburg, Prussia, was a rising power, and a marriage tie would secure the future and safety of her own house. The thought that her refined, intelligent daughter might be miserable in this union paled before the iron logic of statecraft. Feelings are fleeting, dynasties are eternal. Such was the unspoken law of that cruel and magnificent age. Her intended Crown Prince Frederick of Brandenburg seemed to be her complete opposite. Their first official meeting in the summer of 1682 at the spa town of Bad Pyrmont was cold and formal, leaving the young couple with nothing but a sense of awkwardness. Frederick's heart and mind were elsewhere. His wife, the 20-year-old Elizabeth Henriette, was fading from smallpox, and the prince was consumed by his grief. He had genuinely loved his first wife, and their brief marriage had been one of tenderness. The prospect of a new, imposed union felt like a sacrilege, a betrayal of the memory of the woman whose deathbed was still warm. But politics does not pause for mourning. The moment the lovely Elizabeth Henriette drew her last breath, leaving Frederick with a young daughter, the court matchmakers were busy once more. The heir to the throne could not remain a widower for long. The dynasty required a contingency, a new male heir. And so, just a year after the tragedy, Frederick was introduced to his future wife. For Sophia Charlotte, the moment was a disappointment. She saw a man of short stature with a slightly misshapen frame, not blessed by nature with handsome features. But it was more than that. Accustomed to deep conversation and intellectual debate, she found in him no kindred spirit. not a single shared interest. He seemed superficial, captivated only by the outward trappings of life, pompous ceremonies, expensive clothes, and court etiquette. Frederick, however, according to court gossips, was utterly dazzled. And it was no wonder. At nearly 16, Sophia Charlotte was a true beauty. With a tendency toward plumpness, a sign of health and fertility in that era, she possessed strikingly regular features. Contemporaries described her large, gentle blue eyes, thick, dark hair, a straight nose, and a vibrant, healthy complexion. But her greatest treasures were her flawlessly formed neck and shoulders, which she displayed with dignity in the fashionable low-cut gowns of the day. Frederick, worn down by grief and his father's pressure, saw in her not a person, but the very embodiment of life, youth, and hope. He was ready to fall in love with this beautiful image without any attempt to look deeper. And so the union was forged, built from the very beginning on a foundation of deceit and self-deception. Sophia Charlotte was not just beautiful, she was incredibly gifted. She played the harpsichord with virtuosity, danced with grace, spoke several languages, and possessed knowledge that would have done credit to a university professor. She was a product of her refined Hanoverian world, a living work of art. But on the marriage market of Europe, other qualities were prized: noble birth, an impeccable reputation, and above all, robust health that promised numerous offspring. In that respect, Sophia Charlotte was the perfect commodity, a jewel her family profitably exchanged for political advantage. She felt betrayed and alone, an object passed from one pair of hands to another. He, still reeling from his personal tragedy, was unready for a new relationship and saw in her only a function, a beautiful vessel for the future mother of his sons. Their marriage, solemnized in 1684, was a formality, a cold transaction between two powerful houses. Sophia Charlotte prepared to move to Berlin, to her new home and new family. She was heading toward coldness, misunderstanding, and courtly boredom. But not even in her worst nightmares could she have imagined that instead of boredom, she would find a cloying, paralyzing fear, and in place of cold indifference, a world where a human life was not worth a cup of morning coffee. Arriving in Berlin in 1684, Sophia Charlotte quickly realized her darkest premonitions of a cold reception had been childishly naive. The reality was not merely cold. It was hostile and steeped in poison, and not just figuratively. She had expected to face indifference, but instead found herself at the epicenter of a festering family war, where the stakes were not simply power, but life itself. A deep fissure ran through the foundations of the Hohenzollern dynasty, splitting the family into two irreconcilable camps. On one side were the sons of the great elector, Frederick William, from his first marriage, the late Charles Emile, her husband Frederick, and the younger Ludwig. On the other was their stepmother, the elector's second wife, the ambitious and formidable Dorothea, surrounded by a brood of her own sons. This hatred for their stepmother was no mere whim of spoiled princes. It was born the day Dorothea first crossed the threshold of the Berlin Palace, and it grew with every new half-brother brought into the world. It was a classic, almost Shakespearean drama of succession. Dorothea made no secret of her primary goal: to secure the future and power of her own offspring, especially her eldest son, Philip. She saw her stepsons as inconvenient obstacles to her ambitions, a feeling that was entirely mutual. The sons of the first marriage saw her as a predator, ready to tear the state to pieces just to carve out fiefdoms for her children. The atmosphere in the palace was electric with tension, and Sophia Charlotte, a stranger in this world, felt it with every fiber of her being. Then, the quiet animosity erupted into open paranoia. The catalyst was the sudden death of the eldest heir, Charles Emile, at just 19 years of age. Officially, the robust, vibrant young man had fallen victim to illness, but no one at court believed it. The tragedy was far too convenient for the stepmother. Down dark corridors and behind silk tapestries, sinister rumors began to crawl, quickly taking the form of a direct accusation. Charles Emile had been eliminated, and who had more to gain than Dorothea, clearing a path to the throne for her beloved Philip? There was no proof, but none was needed. In a world governed by suspicion, the mere possibility of a crime was tantamount to its commission. Thus began an era that historians would later call the Berlin poison hysteria. This suffocating fear persisted for years, right up until the death of the great elector himself. Any ailment, any fever or stomach pain suffered by one of the old princes sparked panic. Frederick, Sophia Charlotte's husband, suddenly found himself first in line to the throne after his brother's passing. This new status transformed him from a mere adversary of his stepmother into her primary enemy and potential next victim. A man of nervous and sickly disposition by nature, he was fertile ground for the court gossip. He began to believe he was being hunted. The paranoia culminated in a historical anecdote that would be comical if it weren't so terrifying. One evening, Frederick was dining in his stepmother's apartments. After the meal, as the guest of honor, he was served a cup of coffee, an exotic and fashionable new beverage in Europe. Frederick took a few sips and was suddenly taken ill. His heart pounded, his face flushed. In his fevered mind, the pieces of the puzzle clicked instantly into a horrifying picture. Coffee from his stepmother's hands. This was it, an assassination attempt. An uproar ensued. The prince was immediately given a powerful emetic, which he was convinced for the rest of his life saved him. Modern medicine might wryly suggest that the prince's frail constitution, unaccustomed to stimulants, had simply reacted violently to a dose of caffeine. But for Frederick and the entire court, it was irrefutable proof. From that moment on, the fear became tangible. It hung in the air, settled like dust on the furniture, and tainted the taste of food and wine. The prince acquired personal food tasters, and every plate served to him underwent the strictest scrutiny. The paranoia reached such heights that even the long-ago tragedy of his first wife, Elizabeth Henriette, who had officially died of smallpox, was retrospectively blamed on Dorothea. The logic was simple. If she was capable of such acts now, she must have been capable of them before. The unfortunate stepmother, perhaps guilty of nothing more than boundless ambition, was transformed in the popular imagination into a modern-day Lucrezia Borgia, a treacherous poisoner. And into this theater of absurdity and horror, like a lamb to the slaughter, came Sophia Charlotte. She was met not just with coldness, she was barely noticed at all. Every actor in this drama was too consumed by their own fears, suspicions, and intrigues. To them, she was merely an instrument, a beautiful and healthy female whose sole function was to produce another boy, another target in this deadly game. She had come to Berlin seeking her place in a new life, only to find a world that was utterly alien and incomprehensible. A world where family dinners resembled a game of Russian roulette, and where love and trust were long-forgotten words from old books. In this frozen world, where the very air seemed thick with suspicion, Sophia Charlotte desperately searched for an anchor. She was miserable, profoundly, existentially miserable, as only a person torn from their natural element and thrown into a gilded cage can be. She was forced to live by the rules of her husband Frederick, a man whose passion for pomp and endless ceremony was alien and ridiculous to her. His every day was a performance, scheduled to the minute by court etiquette. For him, this pageantry was a way to compensate for his inner insecurity and physical shortcomings. For her, it was a suffocating, meaningless routine that killed everything vital. But the heaviest burden was not the boredom, it was the duty. The nights spent with a man she did not love were not acts of intimacy, but a cold, state-mandated necessity. Berlin awaited an heir, and she was merely the vessel destined to fulfill this great mission. Hoping to escape the stifling atmosphere of the main palace, where every glance felt like espionage and every wall had ears, the young couple moved to the secluded Köpenick Palace, situated on a picturesque island in the River Spree. It was their small sanctuary, an attempt to build a fragile peace far from the poisonous breath of high politics. Here, in the quiet of the parks and away from the ever-scheming stepmother, they hoped to grow closer, or at least learn to tolerate one another. And for a time, it seemed the plan was working. Soon, Frederick announced, with unconcealed pride and joy, that his wife was pregnant. The news swept through Berlin, bringing a wave of relief and hope. The dynasty would continue. Sophia Charlotte was happy too, but her happiness was of a different shade. She saw in it not only the fulfillment of her duty, but her own chance, a chance that the birth of a child might melt the ice in her relationship with her husband's family and finally grant her respect and security. She was so naive. In her timid hope for reconciliation, she even attempted to build a relationship with the one person the entire court feared, the Electress Dorothea. She sought in her not an enemy, but an elder, an experienced woman, a mother-in-law. In return for this gesture of goodwill, she received a dagger in the back. The blow was cowardly, calculated, and humiliating. Soon, Sophia Charlotte learned to her horror that a vicious new rumor, set loose by Dorothea, was crawling through the court. It was whispered that the young princess had not been a virgin when she arrived in Brandenburg. This slander was worse than any poison. It struck not at her life, but at her honor, casting doubt not only on her reputation, but, most crucially, on the legitimacy of the future heir. The courtiers, ever hungry for salacious gossip, seized upon the lie with delight. Now every glance cast upon her swelling belly felt mocking and judgmental. Her fragile world had shattered before it was even built. Despite everything, on October 6, 1685, the long-awaited boy, Frederick August, was born. His birth was met with cannon salutes and public festivities. For a moment, it seemed the joy of a new heir might wash away the filth and dispel the fears. But it was only a brief respite. Their happiness proved as fragile as the infant's life. In January of the following year, after just a few months, the little prince faded away. No official cause of death was ever named, which, in the atmosphere of universal paranoia, was tantamount to a verdict. The court immediately erupted with new, even more terrifying rumors. It was now said openly that the hand of Dorothea was behind this tragedy. After all, the death of this child brought her own sons one step closer to the throne. For Sophia Charlotte, it was unbearable. Her private grief, the sorrow of a mother who had lost her firstborn, was desecrated and trampled into the mud of political intrigue. Recovering from the first blow, Sophia Charlotte and Frederick made a desperate decision. They would try again, but this time they would not make the same fatal mistake. The next child must not, under any circumstances, be born in cursed Berlin. His life had to be saved before it even began. The only safe place on earth seemed to be her native Hanover, her home, where reason and law ruled, not fear and poison. The princess's second pregnancy was spent under the shadow of this secret hope for salvation. It was their escape plan, their only defense against an unseen enemy. But fate, it seemed, decided to mock their caution. Tragedy struck them on the road. The child they had tried so desperately to protect was born too soon in makeshift conditions and lived for only a few hours. This was another boy, another hope turned to dust. For Sophia Charlotte, this was the final straw. She was crushed, shattered by grief. Two losses, one after another, broke her spirit. In her mind, Berlin and death had become synonymous. She flatly, categorically refused to return to the city that had taken everything from her. Her sorrow turned into a quiet rebellion. She would remain in Hanover, in her own world, no matter the cost. And while she mourned her children, the next chapter of the bloody drama unfolded in Berlin. In April of that same year, Frederick's younger brother, Prince Ludwig, suddenly and without apparent cause, departed this world after attending a court ball. According to rumor, he had eaten an orange in the Electress Dorothea's chambers shortly before. The doctors diagnosed scarlet fever, but who in that palace still believed the doctors? The court gossip was unstoppable. The third son of the first marriage, the third mysterious tragedy. The circle around her husband, Frederick, was tightening. Berlin had become an unbearable place to live. For Sophia Charlotte, it was a graveyard for her children and her hopes. For Frederick, it was a mousetrap, poised to snap shut at any moment. The fear for his own life became so all-consuming that he abandoned matters of state and, with his wife, fled the accursed capital. First, they went to the spa at Carlsbad to try and heal both body and soul, then settled in Hanover on Sophia Charlotte's home turf, in her small fortress of safety. This departure was not a journey, it was an escape from their stepmother, from the intrigues, from the ever-present specter of poison. They waited, lying low, to see how this dark play would end. The denouement was not long in coming. On May 9th, 1688, the great Elector Frederick William, patriarch of the dynasty and unwitting cause of the family schism, died in his palace at Potsdam. He had long suffered from gout and asthma, and his passing at the age of 68 was no surprise to the court. But this was the moment of truth. It seemed that now Dorothea, his second wife, was on the verge of realizing her wildest ambitions. She had devotedly nursed her aging husband in his final years, and her influence over him was absolute. This devotion was handsomely rewarded. In his political testament, drafted and revised under her careful guidance, the interests of her sons were fully protected. The document stipulated the division of the vast and painstakingly assembled lands of Brandenburg, Prussia, among all the heirs. Dorothea's 4 sons were to receive their own principalities and sovereign power. Had this division actually occurred, it would have been a catastrophe. The life's work of the great elector, the creation of a powerful centralized monarchy, a single, strong state, would have been destroyed with the stroke of a pen. The state he had spent decades piecing together from disparate fragments would once again crumble into small, warring domains. It would have been the triumph of Dorothea and the end of Brandenburg Prussia's greatness. But history had other plans, and the key role was played by a man who had until then remained in the shadows. Frederick's former tutor, the brilliant and far-sighted politician Eberhard von Dankelmann. He was not just a teacher, but a mentor who had shaped the future ruler's worldview. And he understood better than anyone that the old elector's will was a death sentence for the state. Dankelmann acted swiftly and decisively. Using all his influence over his former pupil, he persuaded Frederick to commit an act almost unthinkable for the time, to defy his father's last will. He argued that loyalty to the state and its future was higher than filial obedience, that Frederick, as the new elector, was responsible not to his father's memory, but to generations to come. And Frederick, ever indecisive and weak, showed an unexpected firmness. He understood that everything was at stake. It is likely that the powerful kingdom of Prussia, which would later become the core of a unified Germany, would never have come into existence if, at that critical moment, Frederick had heeded the letter of his father's will instead of the voice of his mentor's reason. The half-brothers, including the eldest Philip, upon whom Dorothea had pinned all her hopes, were granted grand titles and wealthy lands, but without the one thing that mattered: sovereign power. They remained aristocrats in the service of their monarch brother, not independent rulers. Dorothea's dream of her own dynasty lay in ruins. She fought desperately, appealing to justice and her late husband's final wish, but it was all in vain. Power was now in other hands. The new elector of Brandenburg, Prussia, was Frederick, henceforth known as Frederick III. And beside him, on the newly won throne, stood his 19-year-old wife, Sophia Charlotte. And beneath her heart, a new life was stirring. For the 3rd time, she was with child. This ascension to the throne brought her a new status, new duties, and a fresh wave of revulsion for court life. If before she could at least partially ignore the ceremonial pomp she detested, now, as the First Lady of the state, she was at its very center. Her husband, having become the absolute ruler, threw himself headlong into his greatest passion, creating the illusion of grandeur. He spent colossal sums on lavish festivities, balls, and masquerades, on gold brocade and precious gems. For him, it was a way of proving to the world and to himself that he was a worthy monarch, in no way inferior to the brilliant French Sun King, Louis XIV. Sophia Charlotte, however, despised this ostentation. She saw in it only a vulgar and expensive attempt to conceal an inner emptiness. But all these burdens paled in comparison to her main anxiety. Would she be able to save her child this time? The fear for his life was so great that she spent her entire pregnancy in her sanctuary in Hanover, and it was there, far from accursed Berlin on August 14th, 1688, that she finally gave birth to a healthy, robust boy. He was named Frederick William in honor of his warrior grandfather. It seemed the curse was broken. The dynasty was saved. The throne had a legitimate heir. Frederick's joy knew no bounds, but for Sophia Charlotte, this joy was, from the very beginning, poisoned by the bitterness of past experience and a premonition of new, as yet unknown trials. She had won the battle against death, but ahead lay another, far more grueling fight, the battle for her own son's soul. The joy of a healthy heir was short-lived, quickly replaced by a new quiet despair for Sophia Charlotte. She had fulfilled her primary dynastic duty, but it had brought her neither peace nor happiness. She still did not love her husband and could not share his passion for ostentatious luxury. She longed for the intellectual atmosphere of her native Hanover, for her books and her music. Berlin, with its intrigues and hollow ceremonies, remained a foreign and hostile place. But now, to this dull alienation was added a new, much deeper pain, disappointment in her own son. Little Frederick William, the hope of the nation, began from his earliest years to display a character that horrified everyone around him. As was customary in royal families, the infant's upbringing was not handled by his parents. Immediately after his birth, the little elector was handed over to the care of an experienced wet nurse and a whole staff of nannies. There was nothing unusual in this, but in this case, the distance between mother and son played a fatal role. Sophia Charlotte saw the child infrequently, and each meeting only intensified her anxiety. When Frederick William was just 8 weeks old, he was sent with his grandmother, Sophia of Hanover, and the entire household to Leineschloss in Hanover. His mother hoped that the atmosphere of her childhood home would have a beneficial effect on the boy. But 3 years later, the child had to be hastily returned to Berlin. The reason was simple and shocking. No one could control him. On August 1st, 1691, the little prince returned to Brandenburg, and his education was entrusted to a new governess, the educated and strict Huguenot Madame de Montbale. Sophia Charlotte placed great hopes in her, believing that a firm hand could tame her son's wild nature. But this hope, too, was dashed. Madame de Montbale, accustomed to dealing with the children of aristocrats, soon realized that her new charge was a special case. Frederick William was growing up to be incredibly stubborn, willful, and quick-tempered. Any prohibition, any disagreement with his wishes provoked fits of uncontrollable rage. He sought to dominate everyone, from servants to his own parents, and tolerated no authority over him. Paradoxically, this little tyrant was himself a prisoner of the system he so despised. His life, like that of any heir to the throne, was subject to a strict ritual. He was dressed in what he considered ridiculous outfits, symbols of his high status, heavy velvet coats, scratchy lace collars, silk stockings, and, worst of all, small powdered wigs that mimicked adult hairstyles. He hated this paraphernalia with every fiber of his being and expressed his protest in all the childish ways available to him. He would hide from the staff for hours in the most unexpected places, such as a cold and dirty fireplace. He ruined his expensive clothes, tearing the lace and smearing the coats with soot. But one day, his rebellion took a truly dangerous turn. The story became a legend, at the Berlin court. In another fit of rebellion against some rule, the little prince, to demonstrate the full depth of his contempt for the adult world, tore a gilded buckle from his shoe and, before the eyes of his petrified governess, swallowed it. Panic erupted in the palace. The life of the sole heir to the throne was in jeopardy. The best doctors were summoned, who, fortunately, did not resort to surgery. The prince was given a powerful dose of laxative, and after some time, the precious buckle was safely retrieved by natural means. But the incident showed everyone that the boy's behavior was not just childish tantrums, but a dangerous and unpredictable form of protest. Sophia Charlotte looked at her son and saw not an extension of herself, but some alien, incomprehensible creature. She, who valued intelligence, grace, and self-control, had produced a little barbarian, a savage in royal clothing. Her disappointment was immense. In December 1692, when Frederick William was again visiting his grandmother in Hanover, another scandal erupted, forcing an early end to the visit. It turned out that the little Brandenburg prince had repeatedly and with particular cruelty beaten his cousin, George Augustus, the future King George II of England, who was 5 years his senior. This childhood feud, fueled by jealousy and competition, proved surprisingly durable. No one could have guessed then that this rivalry between two cousins would grow into a lifelong personal hatred that would influence the politics of two great powers when both boys ascended their respective thrones. Frederick William's character did not improve with age. It only worsened. His outbursts of anger became increasingly theatrical and dangerous. One day, Sophia Charlotte entered her son's chambers to find her best governess, Madame de Montbail, in a state of utter despair. The scene she witnessed made her heart stop in terror. The prince, to escape punishment for some new offense, had climbed out of an open window and was standing on a narrow ledge at a great height. He was screaming that he would throw himself down if he was not immediately forgiven and all his demands met. This was no longer just rebellion. It was blackmail, cold and calculated, with his own life as the bargaining chip. When Frederick William turned 7, the era of female upbringing came to an end. It was time for him, like all princes of the House of Hohenzollern, to be handed over to the care of men. With a final glimmer of hope, Sophia Charlotte awaited this moment. She believed that a strict male tutor, perhaps a military man, might finally break her son's stubbornness and instill in him some notion of discipline. She dreamed that this ungovernable creature would be forged into a true soldier and a future king. But these hopes, like all the others, were not to be. The battle for her son's soul was lost. As time went on, Sophia Charlotte gradually resigned herself to her defeats. She had lost the battle for personal happiness, lost the battle for her son's soul, and soon abandoned her last attempts to influence politics. Her political ambitions, if she ever had any, finally died out after the dismissal in 1697 of the prime minister she loathed, Dankelman. She despised the all-powerful upstart, considering his influence over her husband pernicious. But his departure brought her no relief. A vacuum in power is never empty for long, and one favorite was replaced by another, even more disagreeable to the queen. Frederick's new chief advisor and closest friend was Count Johann Casimir Kolbe von Wartenberg, a man of dubious reputation but immense ambition. Sophia Charlotte disliked him on sight, But his flamboyant wife, Katharina, provoked an even greater aversion. And to the utter astonishment of the entire court, it was this woman, who possessed neither noble birth nor education, who became the Elector's official mistress. Frederick, imitating his idol, the French Sun King Louis XIV in all things, had decided that to complete his image as a great monarch, he was missing only one element: a brilliant favorite. True, unlike the French king, whose affairs were matters of genuine passion, Frederick's secret liaison was more platonic and for show. It was limited to joint strolls in the park and meaningful glances at balls. He needed not a woman, but a status symbol, another expensive accessory for his collection. Katharina von Wartenberg, née the daughter of a simple innkeeper from the banks of the Rhine, was perfectly suited for the role with her bright but vulgar beauty. Her origins, however, were impossible to hide. Neither expensive gowns nor the title of count granted to her husband could mask her lack of manners and basic education. She was a foreign element in high society, and the aristocracy, forced to pay her court, mocked her blunders behind her back. But Frederick was stubborn. He wanted his Madame de Pompadour to be accepted at court, and above all, by his own wife. He demanded that Sophia Charlotte officially recognize the new favorite and welcome her into her inner circle. For the Queen, this demand was the height of humiliation. She, a king's granddaughter, a woman who corresponded with the greatest minds of Europe, was expected to make pleasantries with an innkeeper's daughter, whom her husband paraded around like a prize horse. She refused for a long time, ignoring Frederick's commands and pretending that this Katharina von Wartenberg simply did not exist. It was her quiet rebellion, her passive resistance, but the pressure from her husband and the entire court mounted, and in the end, she had to yield. The moment she was forced to officially receive her rival was a personal defeat. But Sophia Charlotte would not have been herself if she hadn't found a way to turn this defeat into a sophisticated and brilliant victory. She took her revenge, and her revenge was as refined and intellectual as she was. The day of the official audience arrived. The entire court held its breath, expecting a scandal. Katharina, dressed to the nines, approached the Queen's throne with a self-satisfied smile. Sophia Charlotte met her with icy politeness. She did not scream, insult, or humiliate her. She did something far more cruel. She spoke to her. She spoke in flawless, elegant French, the official language of diplomacy and high society. She asked her questions, offered compliments, and shared court news, all in a language that Katharina, the innkeeper's daughter, neither knew nor understood a single word of. The favorite stood before her, smiling awkwardly, nodding at random, and flushing crimson with humiliation. Everyone present understood the meaning of this performance perfectly. With a single gesture, without breaking a single rule of etiquette, Sophia Charlotte had demonstrated to all the unbridgeable chasm that lay between them, between a true aristocrat of the spirit and a wealthy commoner. Weary of the struggles and intrigues, she found a refuge for herself. The Queen withdrew from the Grand Berlin court to her country residence, Lietzenburg, a small but elegant palace she had built and furnished to her own taste. This place became her kingdom within a kingdom, her personal sanctuary. Here, there was no room for the hated pomp and etiquette. Here, she created her own court, which contemporaries admiringly called the Court of the Muses. Lietzenburg attracted not grandees and careerists, but philosophers, poets, musicians, and artists from all over Europe. Here, she could converse for hours with Leibniz on the nature of the soul, stage concerts of Italian opera, which she adored, and put on amateur plays by Molière. In this small world, she was finally not a queen, a wife, or a mother, but herself, Sophia Charlotte, an intelligent and talented woman who had found her happiness in art and thought. This palace, later renamed Charlottenburg in her honor, became her greatest legacy, a monument to her intellect, taste, and unbroken spirit. While Sophia Charlotte enjoyed the quiet life in her court of the muses, her husband Frederick was nearing the realization of his life's greatest dream. The title of Elector was not enough for him. He craved a real, full royal title that would place him on par with the great monarchs of Europe. Through long and complex diplomatic negotiations, showering the Holy Roman Emperor with generous promises and subsidies, he finally achieved his goal. In exchange for military support in the looming War of the Spanish Succession, he was permitted to crown himself king in Prussia, and Frederick decided to turn this event into the most grandiose and lavish spectacle these lands had ever seen. Sophia Charlotte, who despised all this tinsel, had to leave her sanctuary once more and play the leading female role in this theater of vanity. On January 18, 1701, in the Prussian capital of Königsberg, the coronation ceremony took place. Everything was arranged with truly Asiatic splendor. The crowns for Frederick and Sophia Charlotte were crafted from the purest gold and studded with diamonds. The future queen herself was dressed in a gown of heavy gold brocade, interwoven with crimson silk flowers and embroidered with hundreds of precious stones that blazed with a myriad of lights in the glow of 1,000 candles. On her breast glittered an enormous bouquet, artfully assembled from pearls and diamonds. Over this magnificence was draped a long purple velvet cloak lined with ermine and adorned with golden eagles. When Frederick, having placed the crown upon his own head, turned and crowned his wife, Sophia Charlotte officially became the first queen in the history of Prussia. The celebrations in Königsberg lasted for 49 days and cost the treasury a fortune. But she was destined to wear this heavy, hard-won crown for only 4 years. Fate, having bestowed upon her the highest title, was already preparing to take from her the most precious thing of all, her life. In early 1705, Sophia Charlotte traveled to her native Hanover to visit her elderly mother. During the visit, she fell ill. It began with a simple sore throat, which quickly developed into a severe inflammation that caused her to suffocate. The illness progressed rapidly, and the best doctors were powerless. It was clear this was the end. She was only 36 years old. She was leaving this world in the full bloom of her beauty and intellect. In her final hours, her son, now a young man, Crown Prince Frederick William, was constantly by her side. He wept as he watched his mother fade. Sophia Charlotte, who had retained her clarity of mind and her signature ironic calm even on the threshold of eternity, looked at him and spoke the words that would forever go down in history. "Why are you crying?" she asked. "Did you think I was immortal?" In that simple phrase was the whole of her philosophical acceptance of fate, her disdain for excessive drama, and even a slight mockery of another's sentimentality. She did not fear her passing. She accepted it as an inevitable part of existence, as the final chapter in the book of her life. Moreover, she never lost her subtle, slightly cynical sense of humor. Addressing one of her ladies-in-waiting, she joked that her husband, King Frederick, would undoubtedly find some consolation in her death. For now, he would have an occasion to stage a grand, incredibly lavish and expensive funeral ceremony, which he could direct to his own taste. In this bitter jest lay the whole truth of their relationship and his character. She knew him better than anyone. With her last breath, Prussia lost not just its first queen, it lost its most talented, most intelligent, and most extraordinary ruler, whose potential was never fully realized. She was a pearl cast into the dust of a coarse and cruel court, and her light was extinguished far too soon. Sophia Charlotte's deathbed just proved to be only half prophetic. King Frederick did indeed give her a funeral of unprecedented scale, turning mourning into yet another grand performance. But behind this external pomp lay genuine, profound grief. His wife's passing shook him to the core. He was stunned by how quickly and suddenly it had happened. In losing her, it seemed he finally, truly understood the caliber of the woman who had been by his side all those years. For several days, he locked himself in his room, refusing to see anyone. His sorrow was compounded by another tragedy. In that same fateful year of 1705, his only daughter from his first marriage also passed away, at just 25 years of age. In a single year, he had lost the two women closest to him. Sometime later, Frederick, true to his dynastic duty, married for a third time. His choice was a young German princess, 28 years his junior, but the marriage was childless and unhappy, and it entered history only as a minor episode. When King Frederick himself departed this world in 1713, the throne of Prussia was inherited, as was proper, by his only surviving son from Sophia Charlotte. That difficult, unmanageable boy who had swallowed a buckle and stood on a ledge ascended the throne as Frederick William I, and he became the complete antithesis of his father. He despised luxury, disbanded his mother's court of the muses, and replaced all the court poets and philosophers with mustachioed grenadiers. All the ferocious energy that had erupted in childhood tantrums was now channeled into creating the most powerful and disciplined army in Europe. For his obsession with military affairs and his incredible frugality in everything not related to soldiers, he earned the nickname the Soldier King. Thus, in a paradoxical twist, the son of a refined connoisseur of the arts and a spendthrift sybarite became the most pragmatic and warlike monarch of his time, laying the very militaristic foundation upon which his own son, Frederick the Great, would build the glory of Prussia. History had taken another of its unpredictable turns.